This afternoon's event is the second in a series of speakers invited by the Simmons Anti-Racism Working Group, a project of the student chapter of the Progressive Librarians Guild. Speakers talk about race and racism in the LAS fields. We are grateful to have the co-sponsorship of SCOSA, the student chapter of the Society of American Archivists, today. If you would like to be notified of future events or help us plan them, or even have suggestions of speakers we can bring to Simmons in the future, please sign up on the sign-up sheet that is working. And today, we are proud to welcome Professor Joel Blanco-Rivera, who teaches here at Simmons. Professor Blanco-Rivera earned his doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh School of Information Sciences. His research interests are the study of the relation between archives and transitional justice in Latin America, government accountability, government secrecy, and social memory. His current research is on the collective memory of the Puerto Rican diaspora in Holyoke. He has an MSI with specialization in archive and records management from the School of Information at the University of Michigan. From 2004 to 2005, he was a lecturer at the University of Puerto Rico's Graduate School of Information Science and Sciences and Technologies, where he taught courses for the Certificate in Archives and Records Management. His dissertation research is a case study of the work of the National Security Archive in the context of transitional justice in Latin America. It focuses on the efforts of this organization to obtain U.S. declassified records for investigations about past human rights violations in Latin America. He's been teaching in the archives area at Simmons since the spring of 2012. Please join me in welcoming Professor Blanco-Rivera.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks for coming. This room looks familiar. I've always been here. So I think the way I kind of divided the presentation today is basically in two parts. The first part, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the topic of racism and race in the archival record. Just to put back in the archival records, a couple of case studies, some of you are familiar, discuss with me, but keep more information on it. And the second part, beyond thinking about race, also thinking about this topic of some of the information called the archival multiverse, or the pluralism within the archives in terms of the active documentation, like community archives and other initiatives that are related with issues of not just race, but also ethnicity and other communities. I will be including that. And then hopefully for the discussion, we'll not talk about in my presentation about that, we can have a discussion about the profession and the topic, some information that I can share with you about that. Let's get started. So as many of you know, because you took your class 438 with me, thank you to archives. A lot of emphasis that is given in terms of what is an archive and what is archives is related in terms of the archival mission, both in terms of the cultural mission, and accountability mission, and also connected to collective memory. And those are important roles within the bigger picture of the archive's responsibility of documenting society. Part of this documentation of society includes records created, for example, by organizations, by governments, for example, that are evidence of their activities and actions. But it is a record and all these definitions. But in terms of the kind of documentation and records that are collected and that are kept for this, are evidence of activities that are not always good stories or public stories. So I have two examples that I wanted to show today. Any of you saw the documentary The Spies in Mississippi? PBS last Monday? Good. Spies of Mississippi, actually. I think I mentioned in my class, but any of you know about the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission? I wonder why. I'll look into it. We're working on that, right? Just to give you some background about this example. From 1956 to 1977, the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission collected information on civil rights activists. The commission was created by the state of Mississippi on the wake of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The objective of this commission was, and I'm going to read from the act that created the commission. So see this language, how very general it is. To do and perform any and all acts deemed necessary and proper to protect the sovereignty of the states of Mississippi and her sister states. Close quote. The governor was the ex-officio chairman of the commission, and the commission had extensive investigative power. I want to just show a short clip, 37-second clip, give you an idea of what this organization was doing.
So other black leaders knew that there was something going on, that these white agents who were showing up at their meetings, taking down their license numbers, were part of something, but they didn't know it was the Sovereignty Commission.
We would always have a say in the meetings. We don't ever have to worry about planning and people knowing, because by the time we leave here and in the morning, they're gonna know anyway.
So the type of activities that this commission was doing was to investigate individuals and organizations that were for the civil rights movement and challenging the racial and segregation status in the state, to compile reports on civil rights activities in the different counties, and also relying heavily on informants to collect that information. After the commission was disbanded in 1977, a legal controversy emerged regarding the preservation and access of the files that the commission created. In January 1977, the American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit requesting the opening of the files. The legal case lasted more than 7 years. And finally, Judge William Barbour rule gave ACLU access to the files for discovery purposes. In 1989, Judge Barbour rules that since these are public records, created by government agency was created, they should be open to the public with stipulation regarding privacy, the privacy of individuals. Subsequently, and following legal opinions and negotiation, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, which had the custody of the files, implemented a privacy review and disclosure procedure, including inviting people who believe their names might be in the records to contact the archives to choose a privacy option, if they were willing to let these files be open to the public or there's any redaction to their information. So in 2002, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History provided full-text online access to the records. So the opening of these files serves various purposes. It officially uncovered the tactics and activities done by the Commission against their citizens. And also, while these records were created and used by the Commission for the purposes of intelligence gathering and also say repression, once they are open, they have a new meaning, comes in terms of new meaning of this record, which include meaning not only in terms of as a historical record, as important for understanding history, but even for issues for topics like historical accountability, understanding that period of time. This is an example of an institution where the records were safe, and the records now are in an archives, documenting a specific period of time. I'm going to give you another example. They have a kind of different story in terms of the fate of records. So apartheid regime in South Africa from 1948 to 1981, forcing racial hierarchy, privileging white South Africans under the system, giving special privilege to them. Moving beyond 1991, there's a start of multi-party talks to end apartheid. 1994, Nelson Mandela becomes president. It's really a very quick overview of this period. Something I wanted to emphasize in terms of this experience is that in 1996, soon after the transition, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, begins hearings on human rights abuses committed by the former government and also by the liberation movement during the period. The report was released in 1998. So I had to do this with archives and records. One of the chapters of the report, I believe is in volume 1, chapter 8, explains the systematic destruction of records by intelligence and security apparatus during the last years of the regime. To be more specific, the National Intelligence Service, which functioned from 1980 to 1994, began a systematic destruction of records in 1991. Another branch, the security branch, began the systematic destructions in 1992. So this is what the report says about this, the consequence of this. Quote, very little pre-1990 material survives in the paper-based microfilm and electronic systems. And also the report stated the following. The Commission's proof into record keeping by the security establishment reveal an almost claustrophobic culture of secrecy, whose transformation requires concerted action. But the most effective tool ultimately was the selective destruction of memory. And it is in this context that the destruction of state records ought to be considered. So we have this important part of history, those records created by this intelligence aides that were destroyed. That didn't mean that the whole story of memory of apartheid was completely in a way. There was an integration of other archives, both in terms of government archives and organizational archives that started to fill kind of gaps in terms of telling those stories. So while the destructions of these records tried to erase that memory, as I mentioned, other documentary evidence, including the archives of the Truth Commission, once they finished working, counters this practice of secrecy and silence. In 1999, the Truth Commission transferred the records of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the National Archives. There are other initiatives that also were taking place during that period of time. It was not just from the government or the state perspective. One example is the South African History Archive, which is an independent human rights organization, archives that is dedicated to documenting and providing access to archival holdings that relate to past and contemporary struggles in South Africa. One of the collections that this archive has is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission collections, which are not the official records. They actually kind of try to document the work of the commission. The organization actively collected archival materials that were related to the Truth Commission and to the work of the Truth Commission. If you go to the website, you see a list of different collections. The collection includes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Oral History Project, and also personal collections of individuals that were involved in some sort of, with the Truth Commission process of investigating the human rights abuses. So this last note about the South African History Archives kind of brings to the next topic, which is related to the theme of pluralism in the archives and the active documentation of historical period, social movement, ethnic groups, etc., particularly in focusing in historically underrepresented groups in the archival record. These kind of ideas, also I mentioned when, in my class, has expanded mostly since the 1970s by archivists, and archivists are currently working with documentation of historical marginalized groups, and they take as one department kind of the 1970s. If you look at publications for archivists, activists, mostly they cite Howard Zinn's talk in 1971 about the idea of the archives not being neutral, and also kind of a point of departure to understanding a different approach to documentation and collecting, making accessible those materials. So these active archivists have been engaging in an active documentation of these groups. In other words, they do not wait until the records comes to the archive, but they go out and find things like using strategies like documentation strategies to document and collect this kind of information. This active approach has also challenged some even traditional notions of what we think about archive, including the concept of archival custody. So, present some examples on that regard. This one article I really recommend you to read, written by Rabia Gibbs, is titled The Heart of the Matter, The Developmental History of African American Archives. Was published in American Archivists at the end of the presentation. I've cited the bibliography so you can see the references. Well, she acknowledges in that process the progress have been made in terms of cultivating diversity, both in the profession and also in terms of the documentation. in collections, she also emphasized that it's very important to establish documentation priorities that are related with the originating communities. One example she presented is the History Makers, which is a nonprofit organization that produces and archives video oral histories. The project website reads the following regarding their purpose. History Makers is committed to preserving and making widely accessible the untold personal stories of both well-known and unsung African Americans. Close quotes. The collection presently includes around 7,000 hours of African American testimony and videotape. Many of which you can browse in the archive and access. This process of documentation has also expanded to other groups. One is for personal interest, because of my background, which is documentation of Latino communities in the United States. So Mario Ramirez wrote an article called "The Task of the Latina Archivist on Archiving Identity and Community." Write the following, quote, "The process of archiving for the Latino archivist takes on the seminal and political role of reinscribing Latino lives into existing historical narratives and of retrieving previously existing notions of self and community," close quote. In addition, Ramirez warns that taking the approach of establishing collective policies that are based mostly with the purpose of countering the lack of historical evidence of communities should not be the only reason for doing this kind of documentation. There will be other objectives surrounding that. So the examples that the pictures you see here, shows various ways in which these stories of Latinos have been collected, disseminated to the media. And those strategies have come from different groups or different perspectives, different approaches. Picture you see at the left comes from an example that is presented by Tracy Grimm and Sean Noriega, an article about the collection of Latino art and cultural materials and the approach of the archivists in working on this. So this approach that they do in terms of collecting Latino collections, which can be considered a post-custodial approach, because in many of the time the work that they were doing was working with the records created with the created the documents, not to collect the materials to the archive, but actually to help them in terms of how to manage and personally organize and preserve those materials, and maybe develop networks and establishing working relationship with records creators and assisting them for handling, preservation, and dissemination of materials. The other two you see, the ones at the right at the top, is the archives of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies in Hunter College, New York. Even though it's an archive that is officially institutionalized in a university, as a college, a part of an educational program, it's also very active in terms of working with the community, not just the Puerto Rican community in New York, but also growing Latinos, other Latinos that are taken in those areas. And the one you see at the bottom in the right is actually not an official archive organization or archivists really taking an initiative of that. It's the Living Diaspora poster series, which is published by La Respuesta Media, an organization that publishes articles and publications about Latinos in the United States. And they actually make a call for Puerto Ricans that live in the diaspora to share their pictures with them, and they will create posters with those pictures, and daily life. They want to also document the daily life of a Puerto Rican in New York and from different periods of time. So this is just one of the posters, and it's basically called "The Joy and Beauty of Being Boricua," which is another one to Puerto Rican. So these are different approaches in terms of thinking about documentation, which goes beyond just to what the archivists do. So these are kind of the examples that I wanted to mention. And I think the other thing I would like for the discussion, then we can have a discussion of just in these examples and this presentation, but also in terms of the profession itself, kind of the diversity questions of the profession. So this is some references I wanted to share. ready for questions or discussion, actually. Thank you.
I apologize that this may be a very broad question, but you seem to have shown a series of events in which archives were destroyed and then an effort was made to fill them in again, in terms of as far as how they can be generalized. I'm wondering what you think would be, these are kind of older problems if you talk about civil rights in the U.S. or South Africa's apartheid, not that they're over, of course, but I wonder what would be the sort of biggest need that you see now in terms of places where archives are necessary, whether they've been intentionally wiped out or whether just things, in the case of the diaspora of Puerto Ricans, if it's just something that has never been sufficiently documented. Where do you think people need to move forward?
To top of my head, one of the examples I might think of, perhaps into like one example probably could be in terms of documentation of communities that might be displaced for reasons, and even including the US, like for gentrification projects and things like that. There's actually one example here in Boston that actually was a successful example, even though it was in the 1970s, which is a community called Villa Victoria, which is a community of Puerto Ricans in that Bay Area. And during the 1960s and 70s, where there was a gentrification and displacement process in Boston, they got together as a community to stay in that place, in that parcel, and they were successful. And actually, they named Villa Victoria. And they're actively today. And one of the things they do today as an organization, Villa Victoria, is a lot of educational, cultural activities, also educational for young kids. So there's a more integrated process in terms of what they do. And it's certainly one of the things, like what Katie mentioned in terms of my current research with Puerto Ricans in Hollywood, is one of the things I'm going to be exploring. So how today there have been Puerto Ricans in Hollywood have been there since 1960, like really big number. So one question: why are how they're using their stories and their heritage for also issues like their social issues like inequality, etc. So I'll see those examples, for example, looking at ways in which kind of the archive, the big picture, can play a role in documentation.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of discussion in recent archival literature about the responsibility of archives towards social justice. I mean, I'm sure you've read the the Jefferson Green.
Oh, the Green.
Yeah. I think that was happening. Can you, I guess, comment on that in light of the work that needs to be done around race and racism in the archives, and whether you see that as being sort of akin to that sort of social justice, conversation that's happening right now in the archives movement?
I think another example I want to mention in that topic is one of the things from the perspective, not just of archivists in the academia, but also practitioners that have been activists, is even coming to terms with the definition for social justice and how to relate it to archives and the role of archives in this, and looking at archives. One of the initiatives that had started by a group of research archivists have been involved in these processes is a project that they're starting to build in terms of building case studies and understanding, kind of developing a framework how to understand social justice and the impact of archives. And they have a kind of a framework, and I don't remember the title, I don't have it right now, but I can share it with you. So I think that's an important step in terms of understanding the role of social justice in archives. But I think the concern sometimes is social justice comes to loose and just popular word, for example, more in terms of the application of it. So I think even though the kind of research I do deal with issues of justice and social justice, etc., I think it is important to look specifically, in terms of the cases, how they impact within the archives. I read Green's article. Still don't know what to say about it. It was like a month ago.
When did that article come out?
The latest issue of American Archivists.
Okay.
December, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. He was basically with criticisms to the social justice idea, but he didn't. I don't think he understood well what.
He was critiquing the idea
Of
of
social justice. I mean, in terms of what, like, the idea, he was thinking, making the argument that arguing that people in the social justice kind of archivism, social justice area, will like this very definite option that everybody, social justice is the main, the only, goal, or aspect like that. It's not necessarily completely true. It's an important part of it, and an important value within the work we do.
So he was simplifying the work.
That's my take. I think Van Jefferson response goes into that area too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's a bunch of us on the mic. So one of the main motivations for community archives is being able to control your own self-identity. And community archives have kind of grown out of the sense that they want to define themselves rather than having archivists define them. How do you fit that into the concept of an archival multiverse? How do you see community archives fitting into these ideas?
Well, part of the idea of when this concept of the archival multiverse emerged from the meeting in 2010 of doctoral students, archivists, and also professors that were interested in the topic of diversity in the archives. And actually, we look at the concept of diversity, and then before using the concept of pluralism. In terms of the archival multiverse, it was more a connection, dealing that actually opens the door to a different kind of manifestations to be part of the archive, including oral traditions, including community archives, including any type of repositories. But they are all part of important part of the archival multiverse. So they have a full influence of that aspect. So that's how I see it in terms of using that term and how we define it.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Sure. So, that being the case, the community archives might not actually consider themselves to be part of the archival multiverse. How do we, as a profession, reach out to those archives? How do we communicate with them that we're not trying to take them over? Because I think that that's a great fear that many community archives have.
One of the issues is, the issue of trust, and that's a process. Yeah. I mean, the example of Noriega and Graham, again, these are the two other authors comes from the university archives kind of aspect, but the way they approach the documentation process was not as, I'm collecting stuff to put in my archive. We were actually more building and trust networkings, and actually they actually traveled to different meetings with people in the arts community, arts community, and they were just part of them. It was not just, they didn't come without, this is how you use the archive. So that building trust is the best way to think about that.
I'm interested also to know about what you think the role of archives are in institutions like this, where there, it's a predominantly white institution. There's, where there's history of people of color, having been excluded from participation at the school, and then integration, and things like that. And I often wonder about how people at institutions that are presumably kind of diverse at this point, or integrated, or whatever, think of their responsibility in preserving history. And I think it's a little bit tied, not just with educational institutions, but with corporate institutions in general, that there isn't necessarily this ethic of social justice. That's not kind of what the point of the archives is, but does have a history that is important and perhaps not comfortable. So I don't know. I think that's probably the question. What are you saying to it?
Yeah, it's a good question, comment. I think finding ways, like for example here, even coming from ways that perhaps as part of the education process, that could be some of the things that we could do. for myself, the responsibility, that we can do some initiatives that can help better. That's better. That's nothing to talk about things like that.
Can I address your question? I'm a bit sort of confused on some points of clarification. So, first, I'm the college archivist here, if you don't know me. Simmons has, no history of excluding necessarily individuals on the basis of race, color, creed, or ethnicity. In fact, we were one of the only institutions to not have quotas on Jewish students back during the time when other institutions did. And I've always maintained that the records of the archives, held in the archives, reflect the records produced by the institution. I mean, my responsibility inherently is to document the institution, which is typically only told through sort of the operational records of the institution, as well as the narratives of the people, places, and things that touch it. So that's manuscript collections can cover some of that ground, oral histories can cover some of that ground, but my role as an archivist isn't necessarily to curate the collection somewhat, and I think most institutional archives would probably agree with this, but not necessarily put an editorial slant on things. This is how I approach it. Certainly I draw some particular stories or narrative themes out of there, but I can't do anything to edit or manipulate the history. If that addresses at all what you were asking, I was a bit unclear, so I'd be happy to follow up. Yeah.
I just want to give you some background. I agree with you that for Simmons, you're correct. We have a great history during the 40s and 30s about not excluding Jewish women like other institutions did. We did not exclude women of color either. However, there was discrimination against colored women, which would be women of African descent, prior to that time. For example, at graduation, colored women walked at the end of the line. And there were times when women didn't live on campus. So Simmons was practicing some discrimination at the time.
What years was this unclear?
That would be according to Ruth Leonard. She said in about 1926, 27, 28. And she was one person. Yeah. Dr. Ruth Leonard taught here. She was a special libraries librarian, so she taught that. And she was one person who actually began fighting against that. Barbara Elam, who was a librarian who went here as an undergraduate. She is an African-American woman who went on to come back to get her master's degree, and she was working in the Boston Public Library, then in the Boston Public Schools. Actually talks about women not living on campus, and Barbara would have graduated about 1950 here. So you have to couch it as of the times. I want to support what Catherine was saying. It was some discrimination going on here, and I believe Ms. Zeeland gave her archives to another institution as opposed to giving her archives here. And it would be useful to have a number of types of archives in an institution to encourage people to give them here. So it's something that we just got to work on. And the reality of the times is that we don't like to think that Simmons discriminated, but they did.
It's quite possible there was an implicit discrimination, or a sort of a subliminal discrimination. I'm certainly not a Simmons apologist in any way, I'm Claire.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to be. I just want you to all be aware that it did occur at Simmons, as it did at other institutions.
And then the other question there, kind of related with some of the examples I mentioned, is it only the responsibility of the college archives to kind of document that period? Is something that go beyond? Not, getting out of the responsibility, but in terms of responsibility to document the records of the institution, when there might be other ways also in terms of documenting the stories that's not necessarily the whole responsibility of the college archives, although they can play a role definitely in that process.
This is just something else. I'm sorry I was late. As an administrator, I had to go to another job, had to do my job. Did you ever talk about Northeastern? They attempted a couple of years ago with Joan Cusack, who was had a grant to collect community archives. And the difficulty she had around that is that she didn't have people of color on her staff so that people would feel comfortable. And she was looking at social justice organizations in the in the Roxbury area. And she continued working at it. You know, you have to build trust to encourage people to want to give your archives to them.
Yeah, that's the best process, really key process. And even if the purpose is or not to actually obtain or acquire archive collections, beyond that could be a participatory process.
I'm the archivist at Holyoke Community College, very part-time, unfortunately. But I came here because I want to make sure that I'm conscious and aware of what we are trying to collect. And I believe that it is the archivist's of a college or other institution responsibility to at least educate the rest of the institution about what has value, and to actually, my experience is a lot of people, whether they're in an institution or private individuals, don't believe that their records have any value. Oh, it's nothing special, we didn't do anything special. Of course, in an institution, you have to collect certain things, but aside from that, for example, student organizations, special groups, I think it's the role of the archivist to educate people and to encourage them to donate their items to the archives and explain what the purpose of the archives is.
And that's one of the things I'm doing in my research, but I have been trying to identify, one of my first steps in what I do in terms of my research and all of this, in the archives, if there's what is in the archives in the traditional sense of, institution, in the repositories, about Puerto Ricans in Hollywood since 1960 in terms of collection. I have identified one big collection that is in the, I will forget the name of the museum there, right?
The Wisteria
Museum. It's a really important collection about Latino life and organization, but that's just one organization.
Right.
There's all the,
Right.
and maybe in the archival record, official records that are not specifically about Latino or Puerto Ricans, but they're as a subject, they use the information of that.
Right.
And then also looking beyond the repository in terms of processes of building memory archives, in terms of using tradition. They continue, like Puerto Ricans in Hollywood, continue to do cultural events
Sure.
that are from the heritage of Puerto Ricans. That is really a strong element for them in their daily life. So that kind of I'm looking for in terms of what is in the archive, in the repository, and what is built outside from it.
I see.
The archive.
And is your purpose, after you've identified these sources of memory and whatnot, is your purpose to try to connect the people who are building their own community archives with the more official institutions, or is that not part of
No,
your
I think
purpose?
one basic question is what is documented?
What is that?
I mean, in terms of the official record, in terms of documents,
Right.
physical documents. What is the story that is told there that can be uncovered? What is not? So that's part of the process.
Again, I think when you talk about the personal collections, that kind of supports the organizational. So if people say, well, for example, going back to my example of Barbara Elam, we had the Massachusetts Black Librarians collections, which has been given here. And then we have the individuals who were notable, Barbara Elam, Francine Gelser, Sylvia McDowell, who are other individuals who also went to Simmons. That kind of strengthens your understanding of what maybe Black social life, what librarians were doing in Boston. So it strengthens to me when you have an organizational and then individuals collections. So are you hoping, when you talk about, I'm sorry.
No, but I think all the spectrum of what is documentation.
Just kind of curious what people think about a discussion I had in one of my classes a couple weeks ago. We were discussing an article about Central Michigan. They acquired some KKK membership records in the early 90s, and African-American students on campus were understandably upset about this, justifiably, I think. And I was actually kind of surprised about the response from some of my classmates in the class who were like, well, they're just preserving the historical record. Like, I don't understand why anybody's upset. So I'm just curious what people think about sort of like documenting the internal activities of like the other side of it, like showing here's what the racists were doing like during a certain time period essentially. So like, because I don't know how I feel about it at this point.
For 30 students, it's your turn.
Last semester. Can I counter with a question? What do you want to happen with those records?
Yeah.
Should we just not know because it's icky?
Well, I don't know if an organization should actively go out of their way to collect them, I guess, because that's what the case was in this. They went at a public auction and bought the membership cards, and so yeah, I'm not certain. It's like they were spending a significant amount of resources to get these, as opposed to.
I'm just going to play devil's advocate for
Okay.
a minute. If Central Michigan doesn't save them, then they go to the dumpster?
Or
Or somebody.
Which might be more, yeah.
Depending on who
I
it
mean,
is.
yeah. I wonder, what do you, do we not need that record as a society?
I don't know. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Well, I was in class when we had that discussion like last year, and I actually agreed, being someone of minority, to keep the records. I think it shows, first also it was in the policy that they were supposed to collect, that it fit into the policy, so that's one thing. It gives both a different side of this history, because I think as archivists we're supposed to capture as many different viewpoints as possible of certain aspects. And so, like, I think I'm one of the few that actually said go ahead and take it, because to me it's like, well, it's historically accurate, and it's not like they're collecting everything else that was in the auction. Like, that's one thing that it was taken out of context. They went to an auction that was selling KKK stuff. Well, they were just taking the records. They weren't taking like the hoods. They weren't taking any of the actual memorabilia. They were taking something that had more value than what everybody else at the auction house was. And I think that was also one of the things I had issue with, was the article issued some facts too. So.
Yeah.
I feel it's definitely complicated, but from an emotional standpoint, everyone just wants the acknowledgement that this is a horrible thing, and that we feel for you, and they want to know that it's connected to that.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, and I think also in terms of complexity, even so, the having as a reason that we have a collecting policy that fits into collecting these kind of documents should not be the only reason for doing it. Because it's I don't know what to say. That's not one of the things that happened in that specific case in terms of kind of, again, talking about crossing relationship even within the community, the university, the archivists with the University College community, and how to kind of establish dialogues with these kind of instances.
Hi, I'm sorry I was late. I was teaching. First, I was just really excited to see this anti-racism caucus coming out of the library. As faculty who's relied on the library for years and years as like the intellectual hub of Simmons, I'm just really glad to see this happening. I worry about this concept about the work is about representing all viewpoints, because that sounds like we're coming from a level playing field. And I don't see the gathering of data as from a level playing field at all. I think we're still living in a white supremacist culture, and it's quite possible that the list for the KKK can find all kinds of spaces, and still we have Alice Walker needing In Search of My Mother's Gardens to look for Zora Neale Hurston's, unmarked grave. So it's not an equal playing field. And then I think about we just saw a slide in the faculty meeting that went really, really fast that showed the precipitous decline in the number of Jewish students from 20% to something like 3% in the last 20 years. And that's the kind of information, and I look at that there's no more black students here than there were in 1972 here at Simmons College. So it's not like in the past we're dealing with these current structural inequalities that are massive, that are going to have a direct impact on what gets collected and not. So for me, an archive that has a social justice mission makes total sense. That's the difference between equal opportunity and affirmative action. And affirmative action to me is something we need to be practicing in every day in all the ways we speak and live and love. So it should be happening in archive.
Kind of related with that in terms of something else I wanted to share. In terms of related with the profession. On the one hand, there was a census in 2005 called the Society of American Archivists. That census established that in 2004 when they did the study in terms of the representation within the profession of archivists in the United States, 7% of the profession was minority groups. From that, 3% African American archivists, 2% Latino archivists. And in the census, they also asked the question of why you became an archivist, and most of those archivists from the minority communities were accidental archivists. They just learn about it somewhere and you can, do it in archives. Now, on the other hand, in terms of other studies, in terms of archival education, although there's a lot still to do, but in the past years, I've seen also an increase in terms of ethnically and racially diverse student population. Again, I'm not saying that we have reached the pinnacle of, but there's important trend both in terms of students in graduate school, in terms of master's program, but also in terms of doctoral students, in terms of population, and also even if you see at the profession, Society of American Archivists, for example, roundtables and groups that are specifically focusing on communities, like Latin American archivists roundtable, there's archivists of color roundtable. So that's also showing that there's some signs of improvement in that area. You kind of connect with what you mentioned, I agree, definitely. One more question? I think that was a classic one, so.
I was just wondering, you talked a little bit about the tradition of archivists working with community activists who are creating their own archives and things like that. Is that tradition mostly based on the practice of, hey, I'm an archivist, I found, I realized the community is creating this really important collection, like, you should let that collection come to my archive, or it's sort of like that sort of kind of takeover that people have had a difficult time building the trust to establish that kind of relationship, or is it more, let me show you, as an archivist, let me show you some techniques or tools or technologies that you can use to help make your archive more sustainable or more well described or things like that. Is that?
That was within the context of community archives, for example, that's one of the areas. Like, for example, there's a part of the UK community archives where that's kind of a website of resources for any group that want to create a community archives, resources about how to build a community archive, how you are an archive, kind of providing information that they can access easily and can learn from that experiences. I think what we're trying to do in the US and building that kind of platform to kind of facilitate that kind of communication. So I think those are community archives that's kind of trying to. Now what I want to emphasize is I don't want traditional to be a bad word. What we do as archivists, even using principles from more than 100 years ago, is still really important, not just for the profession and for researchers, but also for society in general. There's a lot of examples in which archival principles have really been important and powerful for purposes of social justice and human rights issues. So it's not either or. I think it's, again, when I think about the archival multiverse, it's all of that. And it's part of the archives, it's part of what we do, and it's part of the archival record.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I think that one of the observations that has been made recently in the research into community archives is, because there's a recent real growth in community archives, is that approach of, hey, give us your stuff because you're interesting to us, was really counterintuitive in terms of them not trusting us that we're taking over their identities and we're saying this is important about you and this isn't. And so that's why community archives have grown so much.
So now, when Joel's talking about building that trust and working with them and providing them with resources, we're slow on the uptake, but we kind of figured out that that might be a more productive way to go about it. We've always wanted to document them, it's just that we did it the wrong way in the beginning. And there's a lot of great examples of community archives where they don't want to have anything to do with us.
So I know that Professor Blanco-Rivera needs to get to class, so can we all? Do you think there's a way that you can make the references available?
Sure. I can send you the presentation. Yeah.
And I just also wanted to mention, again, the sign-up sheet is right here. Folks want to know about future meetings and events. And and later in February, we're having Akuna Ene, who's a BPL teen and YA librarian, coming to talk about race and racism and YA and teen librarianship. So that's coming up.
And that's going to be, I'll be on that meeting.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic.